Hey everyone, welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast. You know where we take those big moments, so it's those
Yeah.
moments that kind of stick with all of us and we really dive deep. And today we're going back to 1986, to a day that I think really changed the way we think about space travel forever, the Challenger disaster.
Yeah, what's always struck me about this event is that it wasn't, just a simple mechanical failure or something. It was really this whole series of decisions and pressures. And I think at the heart of it, the human element.
You're right about that. I think a
Yeah.
lot of people can probably still remember where they were when it happened, just the shock of it all. But to really understand it, I think we need to take a step back and look at the Space Shuttle program itself. This was more than just a spacecraft. It was this symbol of national pride, this incredible, feat of engineering, designed to be reusable, which was something completely new at the time.
Oh, absolutely. The space shuttle was meant to go up, come back, go up again, ferrying astronauts and all sorts of cargo into orbit. It really was a marvel of technology for its time. And it was made up of these three main parts. You had the orbiter, where the astronauts and the payload were, then this huge external tank, the ET, which was filled with fuel for the main engines, and then the part that we'll get to that's really important to the story, the two solid rocket boosters, the SRBs. Those provided that initial, massive thrust to get the whole thing off the ground.
Right, and those SRBs are going to be a big part of this story. But we'll get back to that. First, let's talk about, well, I guess the start of the show, the Challenger orbiter. This was its 10th mission, STS-51L, and it was carrying an incredible crew.
Oh, a really diverse and accomplished group. You had Commander Dick Scobie, pilot Michael J. Smith, mission specialists Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, and Ronald McNair, payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, and then, of course, the teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe.
Yeah, Kristen McAuliffe being on board really changed things.
Right.
This was a teacher, an everyday person, going into space. It really captured the public's imagination in a way that I don't think had been done before.
It absolutely did. It made space exploration feel so much more relatable for so many people. And the mission itself was very ambitious. They were going to deploy a tracking and data relay satellite, a TDRS, to help with communication with other spacecraft. They were going to observe Halley's Comet and even launch and retrieve a Spartan satellite. It was a packed schedule.
It was a busy mission for sure. So let's set the scene. It's January 28th, 1986 launch day. And here's where things start to get interesting. The forecast was predicting record low temperatures.
And that seemingly small detail is really key to understanding what happened next. There were already some concerns about the O-rings. Now, these are rubber seals in the joints of those SRBs. Their job was to contain the high-pressure gases produced during the booster ignition. And the worry was that cold temperatures could affect the flexibility, the elasticity of those O-rings, which could then impact their ability to seal properly.
So imagine this. It's the night before the launch. And there's this incredibly tense teleconference going on. You've got engineers from Morton Thiokol, the company that made the SRBs, expressing serious concerns about launching in such cold conditions. They were saying, we just don't have the data to guarantee that those O-rings will work as they should.
And it wasn't just them. Engineers from Rockwell International, the company that built the orbiter, they were worried about ice building up on the launch pad
Yeah.
and the possibility of that ice damaging the shuttle during liftoff. So you've got these multiple warnings, these red flags, coming from different sources.
Yeah. And despite all of that, the decision was made to go ahead with the launch. Now, I don't want to get into, blaming anyone, but the decision-making process in this whole situation is something we're going to come back to later. But for now, let's jump ahead to that morning of January 28th. Challenger's on the pad. The countdown is ticking away. Millions of people are watching, holding their breath.
I can only imagine the anticipation in those final moments.
And if you're finding this story as captivating as we are, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any more of our deep dives here on Tell Me More. We've got a whole universe of incredible stories just waiting to be explored.
It's a story that really grabs you right from the start.
Okay, so it's 11:38 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and Challenger lifts off, this incredible plume of fire and smoke marking its ascent into the sky.
And within seconds, these puffs of gray smoke are spotted, coming from the right SRB. Now, it might have seemed subtle to someone who didn't know what to look for, but to those who knew what it could mean, it was a terrifying sign. A potential O-ring failure. The cold had prevented a proper seal, and now hot gas was escaping.
And from there, everything happens so quickly. The flame breaches the external tank, leading to this catastrophic structural failure. Less than 2 minutes after liftoff, the shuttle breaks apart, disintegrating into a cloud of debris.
And it's important to note here, that both SRBs, they were still firing. They'd detach from the shuttle and continue to fly erratically uncontrolled until the range safety officer makes the decision to detonate them. This image of uncontrolled power really sticks with you.
Back in mission control, there's just stunned silence. The public watching on TV, students in classrooms all across the country, everyone who had been so excited about this launch, they're now witnessing this unthinkable tragedy unfolding in real time.
It's hard to even grasp the enormity of that moment.
And then comes the aftermath, the search and rescue efforts, the incredibly difficult task of trying to piece together what happened and why. And that leads us to the investigations and the findings of the Rogers Commission, which really try to get to the bottom of the systemic issues that contributed to this disaster. We'll dive into all of that in part 2.
The Rogers Commission, the group that was put together to investigate the disaster, they really didn't hold back. They determined that the main cause was definitely the failure of those O-rings because of the extreme cold. But they didn't stop there. They really dug into NASA's decision-making processes and this intense pressure to keep up with what was a very ambitious launch schedule.
It's like they were trying to force things, trying to make it work, even though there were all these warning signs. Just to stick to a timeline, it makes you think about the price of that kind of ambition.
It definitely raises some serious questions. And think about the position those engineers were in, to know what they knew, to carry that weight, and then essentially be ignored. It's a pretty disturbing thought.
Yeah, it really highlights how important it is to speak up, to say something when you see something wrong, even when it's hard, even when it feels uncomfortable. And there was one person who really made sure those technical concerns were heard and understood. Richard Feynman.
Yes, the famous physicist. His demonstration during the Rogers Commission hearings, using a glass of ice water and a piece of rubber to show how vulnerable the O-ring material was to the cold. It was brilliant. He cut through all the complicated language and made it clear for everyone to see.
It was a powerful moment for sure. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the aftermath of the disaster. What were the long-term consequences? What changed?
Well, one of the most immediate things was that the space shuttle program was put on hold for 32 months, almost 3 years without a single launch, which really shows how seriously everyone was taking what had happened.
Wow, that's a significant pause.
Yeah.
So what was NASA doing during that time? Were they just waiting?
Oh, no, not at all. It was a time of intense reflection and change. Remember those SRBs we talked about?
Yeah.
Well, they underwent a complete redesign to address the O-ring problems. They added features to prevent something called joint rotation and to make those seals much more reliable.
So they actually learned from their mistakes.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about the hardware. NASA took a hard look at their safety procedures, and they created a whole new office dedicated to safety, reliability, and quality assurance. It was a complete overhaul to try and make sure something like this would never happen again.
It's tragic that it took such a devastating event to make those changes happen, but it's important that they did happen. What about the Teacher in Space program? What happened to that after Challenger?
Sadly, the Teacher in Space program was canceled in 1990. As a direct result of the Challenger disaster. But the idea behind it, the idea of inspiring students and making space more accessible, that lived on. In 1998, NASA started the Educator Astronaut Project, where teachers could actually train to become full-fledged astronauts.
That's amazing.
And here's something you might find interesting. Remember Barbara Morgan, Kristen McAuliffe's backup for the Teacher in Space program? She went through that astronaut training and actually flew on a space shuttle mission in 2007. It was a really moving tribute to McAuliffe's legacy and to the dream of sharing the wonder of space with young people.
That's a really incredible story of perseverance, of carrying on that torch. So in a way, the Challenger disaster, as heartbreaking as it was, it also sparked some positive changes that have influenced how we approach space exploration today.
Exactly. It forced NASA, and really the whole world, to face the inherent risks of space travel and to put safety above everything else. It's a lesson that we still carry with us. A reminder that progress, especially in something as ambitious as space exploration, comes at a cost. And human lives are always more valuable than any scientific achievement.
You're right. We've talked about a lot.
Yeah.
But why should our listeners care about this tragedy that happened so long ago? What's the takeaway?
Because it's a story that goes beyond just that one event. It speaks to something deep within us, our desire to explore the unknown and the importance of learning from our mistakes. The Challenger disaster reminds us that every launch, every mission, has risks, and we have a responsibility to do everything we can to minimize those risks, to question what we think we know, and to have the courage to speak up when something doesn't seem right.
Yeah, that's a powerful message. And it applies to more than just space exploration. It applies to any field Any endeavor where there's risk involved. It's about accountability ethics and challenging the status quo.
Absolutely. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it. The Challenger disaster has left a permanent mark on us. It's a constant reminder that the pursuit of knowledge and progress, while incredibly important, must always be balanced with a deep respect for human life. And it's those human stories, the individuals involved, their dreams, their sacrifices, that really stay with us.
Now, before we move on to some of those more personal stories, some of the lesser-known aspects of this tragedy, we want to remind you to hit that subscribe button. If you're enjoying this deep dive, there are so many more captivating stories waiting for you here on Tell Me More, and we wouldn't want you to miss a single one.
Oh, we've got some fascinating details to share in the next part, things that might surprise you, so stick around.
Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told As podcast. We've been talking about the Challenger disaster, the story of incredible ambition and terrible tragedy, but also the strength of the human spirit. Before we took that quick pause, we were discussing the changes NASA made, the lessons they learned. But there are always these smaller stories within the bigger story, these details that add another layer of depth and meaning.
Yeah, and it's amazing how, even in the midst of such a tragedy, you find stories of resilience, of unexpected discovery. Like the story of the Challenger flag. This was an American flag that had actually flown on the shuttle. It was sponsored by a Boy Scout troop from Colorado. And get this, it was found completely intact after the disaster, still sealed in its protective container.
Really, it survived all that heat and the impact with the ocean. That's unbelievable.
I know, it's pretty remarkable. It says something about the power of that symbol, the flag. And maybe it's also a reminder that even in the face of such immense destruction, some things can endure. And then there's the story of Ellison Onizuka's soccer ball.
Wait, Onizuka the astronaut? He brought a soccer ball into space.
He did. It was part of his personal belongings, and it was recovered from the wreckage. And here's the amazing part. Years later, astronaut Shane Kimbrough took that same soccer ball with him to the International Space Station. And now it's on display at Clear Lake High School in Houston, the same high school that Onizuka's children attended.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like a piece of his love for soccer went back to space and then found its way back to a place that meant so much to his family.
It really shows the care that went into the recovery efforts. It wasn't just about collecting debris. It was about honoring those who were lost and preserving their memory in any way they could.
Speaking of legacies, I think it's so important to remember that the Challenger disaster wasn't just a moment frozen in time. It continues to influence the way we think about space exploration, about how we assess risk, about the nature of human ambition itself.
Absolutely. It's a case study that's still taught in engineering schools. It's a powerful reminder of the importance of making ethical decisions and the huge responsibility that comes with pushing the boundaries of what's possible. And it's a story that, even with all the tragedy, still inspires us to reach for the stars, while also acknowledging the very real challenges that come with that.
It's an incredibly powerful story. And as we wrap up this deep dive, what really sticks with me is not just the bravery of those astronauts, but also the idea that sometimes the most important discoveries aren't made out there in the vastness of space, but right here on Earth, in those moments of reflection, and having the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult.
I couldn't agree more. It reminds us that we all have a responsibility to speak up when we see something that's wrong, to question what we think we know, to put safety first, always. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you've learned something new, and that you'll join us again for our next deep dive into the stories that shape our world.